Institute of the Americas. And it's a gorgeous morning here in La Jolla. I hope it's a pleasant wherever you are joining us from today. This is our last webinar, the last Institute of the Americas Energy webinar as part of our 2017 Energy Webinar Series. So we've appreciated everyone's participation and support throughout the year. Today we're going to talk about state intervention in the natural gas sector and lessons learned from Argentina. And we want to thank again our annual sponsor, Intercap Energy Systems, for their support in allowing us to bring these webinars to fruition every month here live from the Institute of the Americas. We'll follow the usual agenda. I'll make a short introduction, then I'll invite our featured presenter, Raul Garcia, who is a non-resident fellow this year with the Institute of the Americas, working out of his office in Buenos Aires. And Raul will share the results of an analysis he's conducted over the last several months as part of his fellowship at the Institute, looking at the role of state intervention in the natural gas sector, and particularly in Argentina, and some of the takeaways or lessons learned from that case study. We're very pleased. The Institute has worked on these issues for decades. We've worked closely with Raul for many years, and in fact, Raul, when he was the founding chairman of Enargas, the regulator, when Argentina was liberalizing its energy sector and liberalizing its natural gas market, Raul was the founding chairman of Enargas and participated in several programs with the Institute of the Americas at that point in time, and has his capacity as an independent consultant and an advisor to governments, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And we were pleased to have him join us for our Gas and Power Roundtable in Rio just over a month ago, and discussions of the changes in what's going on with not just gas sector, but also the electricity sector in Brazil. But again, today's focus will be on Argentina, and Argentina over the last 25 years or so has been quite a case to analyze when it comes to the natural gas sector. Unfortunately, like many parts of the economy in Argentina, the natural gas energy sector have experienced a boom-bust phenomenon. There's been huge advances and then paralysis, followed hopefully now by recovery of what many have called Argentina's pioneering role in the use of natural gas for its energy matrix. So I want to turn this over and have Raul Garcia share his thoughts and insights and analysis. And I want to let everyone know that this presentation and any feedback we get will be incorporated into the final report that Raul was preparing, and we aim to put together and publish by the end of this year as sort of our final publication of 2017, just as if this is the final webinar. So a final reminder, or a quick reminder, for the question and answer session, we use the function, the chat function, and just pose your question there. You see I wrote the question that pops up, and then we'll collect those throughout. No worries about adding your questions in during the course of the presentation. We'll wait until the end of the formal remarks to have the Q&A session, and we'll use the chat function to discuss the analysis that Raul is going to present now. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Raul Garcia. Like I said, we're delighted that Raul has spent the last several months working with us at the Institute of the Americas as a non-resident fellow. And it's always a pleasure to gain his insights on gas markets and regulation, and particularly what's going on in Argentina. Raul, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jalen, for your introduction, and I'm very grateful to all those who are attending this webinar session. And I will talk about a topic which comes out every day, or I would say every time when we look into governments playing a role in the energy sector. And so the report I prepare is about government intervention, and I chose the cases in Argentina, the reforms of the 90s, and then the subsequent intervention of government Argentina when the gas supply demand imbalance developed in 2004, and that supply imbalance transformed itself into a supply crisis. And that supply crisis lasted for more than a decade, and it's being resolved in the last year by the present administration. So I'd like to distinguish what I would say two types of intervention. One is intervention that has to do with structural intervention, and then government intervention in tariffs prices to sort of the trying to solve supply-demand imbalance. Okay, which is usually takes the place of substituting markets and piling up rules and regulations. That's what is really happening. In order to do that analysis, I will provide you with a definition of regulation or intervention that was developed by Alfred Kahn, which was very well known for his deregulation of the airlines in the US, and he provided a very interesting, very nice, I have used it many times, definition of regulation or intervention in the markets. And I have said, as I have said, I will lead you through these two periods in Argentina, starting with the reforms of the 90s, and then going to the supply crisis of 2004, and then just a little bit about the transition toward deregulated markets once again, and what lessons have we learned, and can we move to a different dynamics, and if we have learned some of the lessons. Okay. So next slide is a definition of regulation or intervention, and you know that government intervention takes many forms. Government intervention can be indicative or mandatory investment planning, setting energy prices, awarding permits, licenses, and many of those activities in a competitive market are carried out by the agents, but that is not the case in regulated markets or intervened markets. Succinctly stated, in the definition is one in which government regulations replaces decisions usually taken by agents in the market, emanating from the authority, and the examples follow. Okay, maybe you would have agents making transactions, determining prices, and determining the quality of the wood they are trading, entering, exiting the market if there is an abnormal rate of return, but that is all replaced, when you have all or part of it by government intervention. But during the 90s, in Latin America, particularly, sorry, something went wrong in the presentation. Let me go to page 3. And this will refer now to the reforms of the 90s, in the sense that the reforms of the 90s aim at developing energy markets, okay, in a steady and efficient manner, okay, to solve supply and infrastructure bottlenecks. There were some initial conditions and setting up a scene of the reforms, which were very important. The macro problems were particularly solved in the 90s, in 1991, 1992, and so that was very important for undertaking changes in the energy sector. We had what I would say a monopolized sector in which there was just one company that bought all the gas and sold all the gas to the customer, and also there was mainly one producer. So the first thing was that was done was trying to allocate roles in order to make very clear what was the role of the private sector that was supposed to lead investment, and what was going to be the role of the government. And for that purpose, it was very important to set up, in this gas market, different distribution companies that were going to be owned by the private sector, transportation companies, and also the creation of regulatory agencies. And the government had sort of an structuring role in the sense, they had the policy, they had the policy function particularly, and the regulatory function included, setting up all the regulations, all the tariffs, for the gas sector. So it was very clear regarding the roles, and it was very important that there was no type of conflict of interest between those who were engaged in the transactions in the sector. Very important was giving a revenue requirement to this company so that they could really take their operations without any problem and without asking for subsidies to the government. And so they were also given contracts, and they had a clear obligation to serve in terms of that they needed to contract all the gas, all the transportation, so that they could serve the customer. And there were any type of imbalance between the gas supply was corrected either by the market, because there was also a deregulated market for large users, and also through the interruption of voluntary interruptibility of contract. So price signals were key, for resource allocation. And the main results during this period was, investment movement, as I will show you in a later slide. For one thing, the size and evolution of the regulated market grew from transactions like 60 to 60% of the domestic gas sale market, 10 years later. The quantity of contracts, they went, from say 25 contracts only in 1993 at the time of the 1992 was the time of the transformation or the privatization, and to more than 1,520 contracts in 2001. Export became a big market, and reserves doubled in 10 years, production increased by 50%, and of course, the industry contracted 61% of the demand on a film basis, and those were very, very clear, good signals, okay, that were being given to the private sector. When we look at the pictures that follow, we have something similar. You can see also how production was going up until practically 2001. And then, after a peak in 2004, they start to go down. And similarly with reserves, a little bit earlier, because the prices were not that good in the international market. But in general, reserves went up, very, very, very high. If you take a look at from 1992 all the way until practically 2001, and then we started to go down, and they are recovering at these last 2 years. We have a similar picture with regard to, this is something that I wanted just to go very quickly. I mentioned the size of the deregulated market, a market in which mostly were large transactions taking place between large users and producers. And you can see there, different phases, the timing in the implementation of market opening. In Argentina, took several stages, 4 years, and in the retail market, we do not have yet, a situation of a free market like you have in the UK. But the issue is that it went up very quickly. And I mention this because this is something that it's being done, all the time, looking at the size of the deregulated market, how is it growing. And if you look at the Argentine case in market opening, it went, from transactions of more or less 350 million cubic feet per day, which is about 10,000 cubic meters per day, all the way down to 17.5, okay, 1,000 cubic feet, which is around 500 meters, more or less, of cubic meters. the size of the market, if you look at the unbundling versus the bundle market, it kept growing, all the way until 33% more or less. That story that I just told you has to do with I would say, is the good news, that the reforms of the 90s brought into place. But later on, we had a situation in which, unfortunately, we had a macro crisis that developed in 2002, and there was in which devaluation was practically triple, and that led to a pickup in inflation rate of around 50%. And the government, because of that macro crisis, which is very long to explain, but it came out with a specification of transactions, a tariff freeze, and suspension of pass-through rules. That is, for gas prices to go into the end user price. Now, what happened was that after a while, the government tried, the previous government, the Kirchner administration particularly, it was the contracts had to be renewed, that is, all the licenses and concessions, but they took very long, and the tariff freeze was maintained for quite some time, and the supply-demand imbalance grew because relative prices for those who demanded gas was very convenient to buy gas, let's put it that way, and very inconvenient for the developing reserves or gas reserves. So that supply imbalance grew over the year, and in fact, what it actually, the intervention, what it did was, to replace, all these market signals that could have come and, with higher prices and possibly, and making supply go up and restrain demand. It was replaced by a potpourri of measures, that had to do with quantitative measures. That is, when the producers unfortunately didn't have anymore the ability to look for their own markets. They had to follow the orders of the government, and they had developed the export market, and they had to redirect all the production that was to the export market into the domestic market. More important, I would say that all these measures ended up in a supply crisis, and of course, because the amount of gas that was being brought into the market was less, and in lower volumes, they had to allocate the gas in a priority way. Gas was not enough, so they resorted to imports. And because imports were more expensive than the prices that were regulated, the prices were not increased because of political reasons. And so you had subsidies, and the subsidies became such a large portion of the budget that they became a macro problem. So we started, let's say, in 2001 with no micro problem from the energy sector, when we ended up with a macro problem with the energy sector, and that's the most clear thing. So I will show you some of the effects from these intervention measures that restricted the movement of prices to solve all the supply-demand imbalances for a long time, and that were replaced by quantitative measures, as I said, that could not, unfortunately, restore the market balance. So the results were gas curtailment, besides reducing exports. I will show you that. There were almost no curtailments in 2001, and the average rose, in 2008, which was the worst year of all, to 20 million cubic per day. gas production fell from the peak of 50 billion cubic meters per year, sorry, to 40 billion. So that's a 20% more or less decrease. Reserves were cut in half in 10 years, okay, until 2012. Imports increased and from almost none, and today we have a maximum of 50 million cubic meters, average between 34 and 40, and subsidies grew up a lot. If you think of that, they were about $500 million in 2005, and as imports started to go up, and imports from Bolivia, and then LNG started in 2008 approximately. So we have they practically multiply by 30, so it's around $50 billion. Okay, so problems, if you look at another picture here, which shows you the what is the how all the types of demands you have in the for each of the from each of the sectors, okay, generation, industrial, and then also from residential, which we call uninterruptible demand, along with CNG. Well, you can see that consumption is much lower than the unrestricted demand. In the years prior to the, by 2001, prior to the crisis, you can see that the unrestricted demand more or less follows, okay, up until 2003 consumption. But years later, you can see the distance between actual consumption and unrestricted demand grows up, okay, which means, that you need the imports, that you need the curtailments to take place. This is another picture that shows you the devastating effects, okay, from the government intervention in the last, starting since 2004 practically. And you can see here the curtailment of exports. Practically, you have exports, okay, that were very, very important in the case of Chile. And starting in 2004, the restrictions came up all the way to 40%. They were going down 0%, 10% more or less, but they started to get worse as the supply crisis developed, and because most of the exports were redirected to supply the domestic market. Okay, and so what you have in this case is a case in which practically all the exports that were going to Chile were brought down to zero. Now, what is the government intervention, way forward, okay, from new initial conditions? Well, one simple thing to say is that, okay, the government right after took play, the administration change in 2015, I would say the energy problem was a macro problem, as I mentioned, because of the huge subsidies, and of course, tariffs had to be increased, okay, if the subsidies were going to be reduced, and the companies were to be given revenues, enough revenues, so that they could actually, do not need those subsidies to run their own businesses. So the government say, okay, we have to go toward market deregulation and the reallocation of laws of roles and the enforcement of those laws that were so important for the market reforms in the 90s. So I would say that the main measures that were taken so far and has to do with tariff pricing, okay? And with regard to tariff pricing, what you can see is the enormous increase. If you look at the blue lines here, the blue boxes, sorry, these are 2016 tariffs. You can see that practically medium industrial and large industrial tariffs, are above residential tariffs, which need a lot more investment when you think of in terms of networks. So you would have expected these tariffs to be higher. So this is what is happening. We are reaccommodating the tariff structure, which is important, but also increasing the level of tariffs so as to be able to reduce the amount of subsidies that are being given. There are many reforms taking place, and I think this is things are moving on in the right direction. But I would say that with regard to the lessons one has is that when one has to compare the situation in the 90s and the situation right now, there is an overregulation from the last period that has to be removed. And so, but we have also a macro situation which is a big issue. Okay, it is a big issue, and before any structural intervention, and that macro situation has to be taken hold of it in terms of reducing, particularly the inflation rate. We also have to have a reallocation of roles because we have the government increases its importance all throughout the period in which it was intervening in the market. It created, a government-owned company, and so which was ENARSA. It handles most of the imports, and so if we need to have the private sector more involved, well, we have to look into this reallocation of roles. The government is leading that function of setting prices. That will likely happen in the next 2 years because still we have still we have subsidies going into the sector. That means lower tariffs for in some industrials and some residential users, and so because the gas prices have to reach a higher level, and the government is also trying to make contracting once again the pillar of the sector for transactions and for investment to take place. That is, those are difficult tasks that the government has to take care of. We know that an important lesson is that when we introduce price controls, there are short-term benefits to customers. That is because, in the previous period, in the 90s, a lot of infrastructure was built. But that was for a short time because, there were no incentives afterwards for investment to take place or for recontracting to take place. But I would say that, as always, the devil is just around the corner. Sooner or later, the energy objectives are not met, and the supply-demand imbalances become evident, and energy relative prices have to be changed. It's, as I say, something that politicians do not usually, some politicians, I would say, do not take good care of, and that is, economic 101 is always present there. We know that each regulatory environment faces its own obstacles, and the government can play in any market liberalization process both a structuring intervention, and a supervisory role. That's what we'd like to see once these reforms take place. And well, once again, government intervention through price controls is not what solves the problem. And removing these price controls and removing subsidies is very difficult. I remember this, from the very early in 1992 when we introduced subsidies for the Patagonia region, and that was a condition to have the laws approved. And now we have that problem, that there is overconsumption, prices are very low, and subsidies are high. So in that regard, it's very, very difficult. It is very difficult to remove subsidies after a while. So possibly best advice is do not establish price controls and unrestricted subsidies which do not correct but worsens market imbalances, and let the market and the regulatory mechanisms work this out. I think this is the main message, and for this new administration, I think is that the macro and the micro problem, that is, the energy problem, still is there. It is being solved. The macro problem still is there, and it has to be solved simultaneously, I would say, so that investment can boom in this market. I think the government is in the right path, but it has it's very difficult, to extend, contracting to and recreate a full operational deregulated market in both electricity and gas. And I would prefer an overall approach for contracting, and rather than a piecemeal approach in which, taking measures from time to time, and that's why it's taking so long. So this is those are my thoughts about these two periods of government intervention, and of course you will find much more detail in the report that I have just almost finished. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Raul. Thank you very much for, excuse me, for the presentation. Very very comprehensive. I think just a reminder, and Marcelo has figured out here how to pose questions. So reminder, folks, to post a question. We'll use the chat function. So let's go ahead and start with Marcelo's question. Then I have a few other questions as I wait for other folks to weigh in. Question, Raul, is if you could talk a little bit about other positive takeaways from the government's intervention years besides the low customers. So are there any other positive elements that can be gleaned from heavy state intervention period?
I would say that I personally didn't find the intervention to be truly good. I would say, okay, the intentions in 2002, the intention right after the macro crisis in which there was a devaluation, starting the renegotiation of all the licenses, I think it was necessary. It was necessary because it wasn't possible to increase tariffs, by demand in which the dollar was being, the peso was being devalued. So I would say that the government inviting to negotiate the conditions under which tariffs were going to be reset. I think that was a good measure from the intention point of view. But it took too long. It took too long. Governments didn't want to pay the political price of having relative prices change once again. That means increasing energy prices, tariffs, and to take account of the increase of cost to all the citizens. So I think, and that was very unfortunate. I would say the positive lesson, and the one can take from that government intervention in particular, is that sooner or later, you have to introduce economic pricing. You cannot intervene a market without relation to economic prices. Intervene and try to set prices benefiting for a while, then you have to move to increase those prices and let the market do, solve any imbalance in the market, supply demand imbalance. So one other thing is that one thing that really was there in that period, I mean, the market particularly was profound starting in 2004, was that it overimposed new regulation and it changed the roles of the stakeholders. That is, because distribution companies could not make any contracts because uh, they could not, the tariffs could not be increased, and pass-through rules were suspended. And so actually producers became those more important actors for supplying all the gas that was needed for the domestic market. And so that was a mutation. There was a mutation of roles, and that was pervasive, really, because there was an existing law that very clearly stated that distribution companies were responsible, but they couldn't afford to take that responsibility. There was no way. So in that regard, I didn't see that much of a what I would say of positiveness. I mean, any positive point from the government intervention
Yeah.
to solve the imbalance of so the supply demand imbalance starting in 2000.
Well, speaking of supply demand imbalance, the next question addresses exactly sort of, as you talked about, a swinging pendulum going back and forth. Let's talk about the pendulum in terms of Argentina's domestic production and consumption. And the question is, do you see Argentina becoming fully self-sufficient in natural gas supplies, i.e. ending imports? And the question is in the next 5 to 10 years. So look a little bit into the future based upon the current reforms and the current market restructuring. When does Argentina recover its domestic production and imports?
Well, domestic production is picking up, but this year is a bit lower, but it's been increasing since 2013, I would say, the last part. 2015, 2016. This year it was reduced a little bit the production of gas, but the projections is for the production of gas to go up, particularly from shale gas and tight gas.
Right.
And so I'm not so sure if it will have, that it will be a self that it will provide its own gas and will be able to export all the time. But I'm sure that what Argentina can do is, it will, for sure, is that if intervention in prices is toward economic prices for the next 2 years, and pass-through mechanism works and all that, I believe contracts will extend for more than 2 years. Okay, and that will bring an impulse to, they will bring a push, okay, to government production. That's on the one hand, and so it is very likely that we will have imports, okay, during the winter time, particularly LNG imports, and that is not a problem. We will have exports during the summertime because demand is very low and production from shale needs an additional market. So I think we will move into an export-import situation, and the issue is not being the country that produces and is able to consume and export whatever is left. I think the idea is that it be well supplied, that the country be well supplied, either by import through imports or through production, but with no bottlenecks, okay, and solving this supply demand imbalances of this. Yeah.
All right, I want to come back to that interesting point you made about the seasonality perhaps of the market and the LNG imports. I want to ask you a question about that, but let's first, Benigno has a question that ties back to something you were talking a little bit about on the production side. And the question is about unconventional resource development. And are there enough incentives from the government to develop Argentina's world-class unconventional resources. We've talked for many years now about Vaca Muerta and Argentina's unconventional. So are the incentives in place to really unleash that potential?
Yes, I think shale shale production will go up significantly. Actually, shale is taking, as well as type, is taking a larger share of existing production. In the Neuquén area, it's becoming sort of a 50% of the production, which is the area that almost takes 55% of all the production in Argentina. And shale production is going up, shale and tight, sorry, so as to become now 30% of the market. So the prospects are very good for that to happen. Okay, and I think the prices are going to be interesting. So far, we have a range for these type of contracts from 5 to 7.5 and going down to $6 approximately, I think, in 2021. So I think those are good prices for having investment take place, and additional investment taking place.
Well, and there was a land, maybe you can talk a little bit about earlier this year, where the government, the Macri government, together with provincial government, companies, and also union leaders, and they signed an agreement to try and reduce costs, improve efficiencies, deal with some of the labor issues. And since that, I think we've seen a lot of announcements of investment commitments. But so that's something that you're optimistic about, that will continue to lead to production gains.
Yes, I would say that the agreement that was reached with the government of Neuquén was very, very important. And the reason being that it went to the economics of producing and developing, oil and gas in the whole area. And I would say that it went to the micro issues. That is, trying to lower the cost of the cost of labor. That reducing, slack time and things like that in the contracts that were making the production of hydrocarbons expensive in that area. And so, and that is being replied by, in the industry, trying to reply that into other provincial areas. So I think that's a very good point. And actually the aim of some of the producers is, bringing down the price of gas all the way to $4.5 per million BTU, which, if you think that today the market is, the average is between 4.5 and $5, and some of the shale gas pay 7.50, 50. Okay, so I think good prospect as long as you are able to reduce the cost of gas. Okay, and I think that type of programs, as you mentioned at the beginning of the year, were in that direction.
Excellent. Interesting about the replication efforts in other provinces. Let me we'll see if anyone has any other questions. There's something I wanted to ask you about, both tying back something you talked about, the continuation of LNG exports in the wintertime, excuse me, the LNG imports in the wintertime. And then you had an interesting graphic and discussion of the amount of subsidies and how they grew over time and how much of a fiscal impact they had for the government. So a question I would have is, as the Macri government in the last couple of years has reduced subsidies and increased the tariffs, what are those numbers looking like in 2016 and 2017 in terms of the fiscal impact for the Treasury? And so with that, I would be interested in seeing, obviously if they continue to do winter LNG imports, I'm guessing it's more of a spot market kind of arrangement. So does that continue to have a fiscal drag, or has it been sufficiently dealt with by reduction in the residential and other subsidies?
Okay, that's a very good point. Um, the government has had a very, very hard time reducing subsidies. Subsidies were cut in half, particularly because when you compare, let's say, 2013 and let's say 2016 or 17, the reason being that the price of, the imported gas price went down. Okay? That's one thing. But at the same time, though tariffs were increased, at the same time, some social programs were increased. There is a social tariff, and now takes about 30% of all the residential consumption in some of the distribution. So, but if you compare the last 9 months of subsidies from 2017, 2016, they haven't reduced. Okay, they haven't reduced. The question forward is that these subsidies will be reduced even more because that is, we have another push now by the end of April. Sorry, starting on April 1st, we will have the last tariff increase from a 100% tariff increase. 30% of that will take place. The last 30% will take place in April 1st. And there will be reductions in these subsidies to the social tariffs, the requirements to apply for social tariffs. They will become more stringent. But on the opposite side, for the subsidy going up, maybe, is that unless the LNG is being replaced by highly productive, domestic production, LNG prices may go up. They will start going up. We rely on spot purchases of gas. They have been very convenient, even up until last May, I would say. We were able to buy LNG at, say, in some cases, 4.5 and $5.5, okay, before regasification. But, it's a question mark if, if the dollar, if the price of oil, as it is today, is about $65 per barrel. So I think, and I have discussed this with others, in the Institute of America last meeting in Rio, that Argentina is taking a position, a difficult position, because if it buys all spot, it may be, that it may hurt this import situation, but also, the subsidy side, So there is going to be a mixture of long-term contracting energy and spot, and buying on spot. So because the situation of a market calls for that. So that's my question.
Well, maybe that brings me to the final question, and thanks again, Raul, for your analysis, and we look forward to the final paper, which will have obviously a much greater details on many of these points raised this morning. So one of the things you said at the end, I want to push you on, and it's the way going forward, and you called sort of, I'd say your recommendation is an overall approach. So to conclude our discussion today, I'd like you to spend a minute or two helping us understand what is comprised in an overall approach from your vantage.
Yes, I would say it's the government is taking steps, okay, step by step, saying, okay, now, but they have not announced a program, okay, of of saying, okay, now we have a situation in which they have made, I mean, the government encouraged some agreements between producers and distributors, okay, for a 2-year contract, sort of. So they allocated gas and all that among the producers and the distributors, helped were very helpful in that direction. So that's a transition. But that transition may last 2 years, but we do not know very clearly how the market is going to evolve in terms of, even though, with regard to subsidies, the government said subsidies will not be there except for the social tariff by in the next 2 years, but we don't know how the transactions are going to be taking place in this regulated market. For instance, are there going to be biddings, for the contracts from the distribution companies to the producers? Will the secondary market develop in a more transparent way in which the capacity which is being unused is going to be put into let's say, a bulletin board. Similarly for gas, in the secondary market during winter time. So there are many issues. It's not very clear, and they're not very clear because the I think the agents wait for some stronger signals, regarding, through mechanism that it will really take place, and and I think that that's one of the issues. And the other thing is that even though imports are free, are really import free when most of the gas has been imported by just one company, either through the either LNG or imports from Bolivia. So I think the government has to sort of make what I mean by overall approach, sort of give the all the measures that are going to be taken, to open up the market and to contracting more transparent. And so, this piecemeal approach of going just, first tariffs, the level of tariffs, because, the structure of tariffs is something that needs to be changed. When will that take place in the second rate review after this one? And well, I think if you want to have in the market really operative in the next 2 years, those guidelines, I would say, have to be put very clearly by the government. Okay, for instance, the electricity sector, CAMESA, which is practically buying all of the gas for that is being used in power generation, thermal power generation. It's also the buyer of all the contracts in renewables and all that. Will that be permanent? Because that's practically a company obeying all the government directions. And so, where is the market that is going to be developed between private generators and gas market, say, or gas producers or gas marketeers, if you know that if it, as it actually is, the deregulation in the electricity sector is happening, but very, very slowly, because prices have to go up very, very high to remove all the subsidies. So it is very difficult to say buy LNG at say $6 or $7 if gas is being sold at 4.5 or $5. Okay, so so the thing is, we have to make very clearly, that how is it that the whole structure of the energy sector, electricity, and also the gas sector is going to function. Okay, that's what I mean by an overall approach,
Yeah.
and not a piece.
So we'll need to stay to see how many parts of that the Macri government follows through on in the coming, really coming months. And as you said, there's still some more tariff adjustments coming in the new year. So, well, we're out of time for our final webinar of 2017. I want to thank Raul Garcia for his insights, and it's always a pleasure to have your expertise in discussing the markets in Argentina, especially when it comes to natural gas. Speaking of natural gas and markets, we're going to have a morning program this Friday morning in Washington, D.C., where we'll have some folks from the Department of Energy and Department of State with us to talk about particularly the commercial relationship with the United States and the hemisphere on natural gas, LNG exports, and just sort of where things are developing and some of the things that Raul talked about, LNG imports in Argentina, and as the U.S. continues to expand its capacity for LNG exports on the back of our shale revolution. So we thank you all. Hope to see you in person, and it's never too early to announce and invite you to La Jolla for our annual energy conference. That's next May 23rd and 24th. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we actually will update a lot of the goings on and share this presentation recording. And of course, where we'll share the final report that Raul is finishing right now. Thanks again. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. We look forward to seeing all of you either in person or here online as we go into 2018 for our 2018 Energy Webinar Series. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you all. Okay.
Have a great day.